So this is the first time I've done a material breakdown, but I thought I would show you something I've just been working on recently. It's just a quick sort of overview on how I made this sort of medieval fantasy stone wall tiling texture in Substance Designer. So I think we'll start just by looking at the base tiles. It's really simple. It's just a tile random um, with some of the settings changed from the default. I won't go over all of them because it'll take quite a while, and it's sort of up to you. If you want to follow along, you can kind of change them how you'd like to. The edge detect after this is just so I can change the width sort of separately from going inside the tile random. Although you could do the same with the scaling settings and things inside there. So first off, what I did was I made some flood fills using the new flood fill node. And I just gave it the base tile, and I made two gradients and a flood fill to random color. And what you can do with the random color is use an RGBA split, and then you get 4 grayscale masks out of just 2 nodes here instead of having 4 separate flood fill to random grayscale. So that's quite a cool tip. Inside here we've got the chunks sort of that cut out of the stone, and we're using a directional warp node with a really high value like 289 as you see here. And what we want to do is give it one of the masks that we made earlier with the RGBA split and put that into the intensity output. So what we do is we have different values here now for each of the rocks instead of having it straight up kind of like on top of it. It just breaks the procedurality, I think, and you get a lot more variation in what you have. You might notice here, although it may not show up in the video, sometimes you get some banding on here when you use this purling noise. So I just blurred it, and it also sort of fixed some of the issues with the creases here. And then on to slope, height, and variation. So we also just used the masks that we made from the RGBA split, and also the 2 gradients that we made from the flood fill node as well. And they're just kind of multiplied on top, or like this one for example is min darken, and it just kind of gives the variation on the surfaces of the stone. And then this is not much of a bevel, but essentially I'm just overlaying with multiply here the original edges, just so we've got a kind of clear edge there. And the peaks are where the rocks kind of just pop out a little bit. So we're using an inverted cells 1, also with a directional warp, and I just slope blurred that a little bit just to break up some of the regularity of the noise. And then what we want to do is, now that we have the peaks, we can also make some sort of subtracted areas. And then we can move on to the edge cracks, which are sort of like the general detail that we have here on the edges. So we're starting off with a crystal, but we're just blurring it a little bit to get the sort of gradient a little bit more smooth there. And then directional warp to break it up, and into a slope blur grayscale. Of course this node is really great for things like that, so you can always try different noises in there and see how it works out. We're also doing another one afterwards with a clouds 2, and that's just for the smaller sort of cracks and chips on the edges of the rocks here. After that I tried to do some sort of textured recess, which is kind of like just increase the contrast. I warped it again using the directional warp trick, and it just kind of gives some more areas of like height variation, but with a little bit more texture to it. After that, it's moving on to surface detail. I find black and white spots is really good for this because you get kind of like these small round noises, but also a larger sort of cloud looking texture. And that's also with the directional warp to break it up, and on with add sub, so we can get some height and some sort of multiply going in there as well. Next is a fractal sun base, and this is really good for sort of a microsurface noise that you can see. You may not be able to pick it up on the video, but it's really important to get this sort of textured look. And then we're just making a sort of really simple mask for the grout. I use a non-uniform blur inside here just to blur it out, so the fractal sum base then on top will have sort of no interference with that, and that's just blended with the height blend. That's pretty much it then for the normal, so I just set it with intensity of 15, and I thought that was quite a good value for the normals. The base color then is just using a fractal sum base with a gradient picked color palette from an image that I found online, and also using the height into gradient map 2 with a similar sort of color. It's then blended on top of each other, so you get a little bit of a different look than just a single gradient map on its own. And then using one of the RGBA split masks from earlier, we can use add sub or something like overlay on top of there to get a difference in the levels there. I find also at this stage a curvature smooth is really good for adding some color as well. So you can kind of just use a gradient map here and pipe it into like a min darken or something to get the darker areas of the curvature, and then also a max lighten to get the peaks, like some highlights on there. After that it's some hue shift, so you can see the difference here. We're just using HSL with some altered values, and then just using one of the masks again from earlier, and same again just with different hues. After that I made some discoloration here, just using the clouds one with the higher scale, and then use the directional warp to break it up again, and a gradient map that has the alpha inside, so we can just blend it on top there with copy. At this point I actually realized I wanted to do something more of a like a bluestone, because I felt that this was working a lot better than the colours that I had before, although most of the time it's a lot easier to know what you're making from the beginning, and just keep looking up references and things like that. And then I used the mask from earlier that you get from the height blend, just to put the colour of the grout on top there. After that it's just a couple of dirt nodes into gradient maps and on top, and again just on top of the gradient map, using the alpha again. And then I wanted to try adding some moss, so I used a little bit of a directional warp here just to offset slightly per brick, but not too much. And then into a gradient map that I just picked from an image. And then I used the directional warp node here as a mask also, with the levels changed. Then we added some more sort of mold. This trick I used spots into a histogram scan, blurred it to get softer edges, then I use a gradient map that plays with the alpha, and what it does is kind of makes the center of the spots with a really low alpha, and then as it gets towards the edges the alpha increases, and you get this kind of look here on the rocks. It's set to really low, so the tiling is a little bit less noticeable. And then after that we're kind of just using all of the same noises and things that we've added here to blend into the roughness map, which is really simple. It's just starting out with a fractal sum base, and then we're adding things like the curvature and things like that just onto the dirt and overlaying and things. And you can also at this point you can do your ambient occlusion from the height map that you finished, and the height map itself, although I did use the final height map, it's probably best to use something earlier with a little bit less noise. So yeah, that's about it. The metallic should obviously just be set to black, and yeah, thanks for watching.